The Daily Code Snippet. This past week, we switched gears and built a web page for you to use to test code, so it is a bit longer than previous weekly recaps. The best way to learn code is to learn by doing. As you work with code, you will become more adept at recognizing typos that can often break your code. It will also be a good review of previous topics and show you how to put things together. By saving a copy of this demo webpage, you can always add sections to try new code as it is demonstrated to you. This way, you are not only watching a video, but trying the concepts and see if you get the expected results. In order to begin, you will need a code editor. I personally use BBEdit. I prefer its simplicity, but you are welcome to use whatever code editor you wish. It can be downloaded at https://www.barebone.com/products/bbedit/download.html. We will also need a browser to preview our code results, and I will use Google Chrome. But again, you can use whatever browser you prefer. Once you have downloaded a code editor, start a new document. Save this document index.html. Index indicates to the browser that this is a web page to open first. The .html indicates it will be an HTML file. The first thing you will write is your DOCTYPE declaration telling the browser that you are working in HTML5. Less than sign, exclamation point, DOCTYPE, HTML, greater than sign. This is how it would look in your code editor, and if you open the document with a browser, you won't see anything because this is a backend change and does not display visually. A web page consists of a head and a body. The head contains information that helps your web page function but doesn't necessarily visually display. For example, any scripts, styles, fonts, and metadata. But the title of the web page is in the head and it displays on the browser tab. The body contains the main content. Both the head and the body are wrapped in the HTML element. The body is further divided into a header, which typically contains logo and branding, the website navigation, nav, and social media. Main may denote the page content that may be further divided into sections, articles, and asides or sidebars. Then we have a footer that may contain a secondary navigation, social media, copyright, website policy information, and contact information. So for our demo code page, we will start with building a head and title. We will create our body and place within it a header with an internal navigation for 3 sections. We will close with a footer with placeholder content. So here we will show you the process in BBEdit. We have already our DOCTYPE HTML declaration. We add our head and we place our title inside. And we're going to title our web page Demo Code Page. We add our body. And remember to add your closing tags. We enclose everything in our HTML element. I tend to like to write the opening tag and the closing tag at the same time so that I don't forget to write the closing tag. Within the body, we will put our header. And within the header, we will add our nav. We will create a main section and divide the main into 3 individual sections and give each of those sections a unique ID. When writing sections, it is useful to use your commenting to denote when your section ends. It just helps to keep things organized. And to make things faster, we can just copy this 2 more times and then change our ID to 2 and 3. We can add our footer. I'm just going to put copyright information. Option G. is a way to get the copyright symbol using a Mac keyboard. Within each section, we're going to put a little header. So a third level header saying section 1, section 2, and section 3. Within our navigation, we're going to create our list elements. And these will have our links to the different sections on the web page. So we're going to link to our ID attribute for section 1, and then do the same thing for sections 2 and 3. And then within our headers, since we're not really going to put in a logo or specific branding, we're just going to put in an H1 level header that says that this is our demo code page. So here we have basically now a basic structure for our web page, and we can now look at this on a browser. So we'll open this index.html file in our browser, and we see now that our browser tab up at the top says demo code page. So that is controlled by the title element, while the demo code page you see within the browser window is our H1 header element. And we have our navigation. It's not really styled, so it's just presenting as a list, an unordered list with bullets. And each bullet in the navigation is a link to each section. Now, because we don't have a lot of content on this page, it's not really going to jump you anywhere when you hit these links. But when you have longer content where maybe section 2 and section 3 are off screen, if you were to hit the section 2 link, then it's going to jump you down to that part of the page. And then we have our sections, which are denoted by our header elements, our H3 level header elements, sections 1, 2, and 3. So we haven't done any styling on our page right now. We don't have any cascading style sheets or style. This is just determined by our HTML. So you do see these hierarchical elements where you have your H1 level header demo code page much larger than our H3 level section headers, section 1, 2, and 3. And then our footer is basically displaying paragraph level text, and that's the copyright information. So without adding any styling about the size of text or anything like that, our HTML is actually determining some hierarchical structure for our web page. And it's just going to draw in, because we haven't told it what font we want to use, it's just going to draw in a serifed font that it finds to use in our web page. You see that we have this navigation here. This is an unstyled, unordered list, and we want to make it look more like a navigation with actual buttons. So we are going to add a little bit of styling. I know we haven't really gone over the CSS, but we're going to show you some basic things. And so our navigation, we realized from yesterday that we forgot to put in our unordered list surrounding our list elements, so I'm going to put that in. And In order to add some styling, we're going to add it embedded in our head rather than adding a style.css that we're going to load in. We're just going to embed it directly into the head, and we use the style element for that. Because we're keeping it simple, it's fine that it's just embedded in this one single page. So we'll add navigation as a comment just to keep ourselves organized, so we can always look for the styling that's directed our navigation in one spot. And we're going to target our list elements, and we want to remove that automatic bullet. And so what we're going to do is put in a command, list style type equals none. Save that. So I'm hitting the keyboard shortcut Command S to save my document. And then when I go to the browser and I hit Command R, which is to refresh the page, it's going to take in the new code that we just added. And we see that the list style type, the bullet, has now been removed. And then we want now the elements, rather than being listed down in a column, we want to make it each button across. And so in order to do that, we're going to have it float. And so float just means that it's being taken out of normal positioning, and it's going to float to the left. So each element in that list is going to float towards the left of the item before it. So if we add this command and we look at what happens on screen, you can see that now instead of going section 1, section 2, section 3, one below each other, they now move to the right, and they're floating against the previous element. So the section 3 is floating against section 2, is floating against section 1. We also see that section 1 from our content is also floating. And why is that happening? Well, because all elements will start to float until you tell them to stop floating. And so we want to go to look at the next element that we don't want to float anymore, and that would be the main. And we're going to tell it to stop floating. And so we're going to add that. And we're going to tell it to stop floating. So the command to stop floating is clear both, because you can either float left or you can float right. And what we want to clear is any floating left or right. So clear both. That's why that command is that. And when we hit return, we see that it stops. The floating stops at this point where the main starts. So we still have these items kind of next to each other and kind of abutting one another, and we don't really like that. So we want to add a little bit of space between each element, and we'll do a margin right of 20 pixels. So remember, with if you just put margin, then you're going to have to specify. This is going to say all around, top, bottom, left, and right is 20 pixels. So if we only want there to be margin on the right side, we have to tell it that. And so once I save and refresh, so now there's a little bit of spacing between each of these. And we do note that there's this gap here, and that is coming from our UL element. And we just want to tell it to remove all the space around it. So we'll remove all the padding, and then that should have it no longer kind of floating there to the side. So now they're all abutted to the side. They're floating next to one another. And what we also might want to do is remove the underline on the links. And so that the links are the A element. So now we want to kind of target our link element. And so in order to remove that underlining, we go to remove the text decoration. And so text decoration none. And in order to make this look more like a button, we want to add some spacing around each of these elements. So we're going to do, this is sort of a standard spacing, and then we might want to give it a background color. So it looks like button, and we're just going to give it a gray color, a light gray color. And you can see now that it has that spacing. And the text looks a little hard to read. We're going to make the color white against the gray background. So now we have that. And now when buttons, sometimes you want to have an indication that you're hovering over a particular element, that something changes so that you know what you're selecting. And so in order to do that, we add a little hover command to our link. So a hover. And we're going to make the background color black. And these are basically shortened hexadecimal codes. So when the number is the same, 999, it's actually 999. Hexadecimal codes are 6 letters and numbers that indicate a particular color. I know this to be a light gray, 999, 999. And when you have something that's the same number or letter across, then you can all shorten it. So FFF is white, and 000 is black, or 000000, and FFFFFF. These are things that, you know, as you code, you'll memorize certain colors, something that you can use quickly. So now we see that whenever we hover, it's going to turn black. And then there are other A states. We won't kind of get into those, but there's, you know, what color should it change to if you're actually selected it, or if it's already been visited. Sometimes a user may want to know that they've already went to a particular link, so you may want to have a visited color. We'll kind of go into that more in depth when we're really going into the styling of link elements. Like I said, this is sort of meant to be a quick page that you can use to sample code, and we're not going to be very complicated with it. But looking at our page, you can see there's kind of like everything is scrunched together. So we kind of want to add some spacing. This is our header, so we may want to give the header like a fixed height. I would say maybe about 150, 200 pixels. And that way there's some space, and each section, like I said, we're going to give it a fixed height as well, so that, you know, when you click these buttons, it's actually moving you somewhere, as opposed to having them all scrunched together like that. So what I'm going to do is put in a little bit of a header style. I'm going to fix the height, like we said, to maybe like 150 pixels. And that kind of pushes that down a little bit. And I'm going to make each section maybe 500 pixels in height. And this is while we're kind of making this up as we go along. And once we have actual content, then we won't need to artificially create the height of our sections, because the content will have the actual height based on the content that's there. But if we go back and take a look at how our page is shaping up, we see that now we have sections that are 500 pixels in height. We have a header that's about 150. If we hit the buttons, then now, because some of the sections are scrolling below, we will jump to that section. But you may wonder, well, why did I add this giant gap of 200 pixels? And then this is why, is because what I really want to do is I want to have our header to be fixed at the top of the page. And positioning is something that's a bit of a advanced topic, but I'm going to kind of show it to you here. And so we added that 200 pixels to give it enough space so that there's a little bit of a space between the maximum height of the header and then the beginning of the first section. So that's why there's that little bit of a 50 pixel gap there. And by fixing the positioning to the top, that means that the header will stay in place at the top of the page while the things scroll behind it. And you can kind of see that you can see it show through. So what we may want to do is also add a background color. And that way, it'll kind of disappear behind that header. Now we see that you can kind of see at the top, and that's because there's usually a little bit of a gap until you make sure that you have no margin or padding around all your elements. And the other thing we want to do with our page is we don't usually want it to go span the entire width of the browser, so typically you want to do something like 80%. So we're going to add it to the body so that everything is included. And then by adding margin 0 auto, what we're saying is that we don't want any top or bottom space, so we want it really to be the top of the page, no gaps. And then auto, when placed in that left-right position, will tell the browser that we want it to automatically calculate the space on the left and the right so that the content is centered on the page. So that's how you center things on the page. I hit a key by mistake. So now we see things kind of shifted to the right so that they're now centered. And when things are scrolled behind, there's no more gap at the top because we've made sure there's no space between the header and the top of the page. So now everything is ready. We can use the navigation to go to each section. Once we put content there, we can jump to it directly using our navigation. We have our header fixed, so that means that we always have our navigation available to us, no matter where we are on the page, to move about. And what we're going to do is actually change the table demo head to a level 4 heading H4. And we chose code that has the information that helps those with assistive devices. So we have a caption that tells the user what the table is about so that they can decide if they want to continue to read out the contents of the table or if it's something that they can skip. And we are also using code that contains the T-head, the T-body, and the T-foot. And this table data also uses the scope attribute that lets the browser know more clearly whether a table header element is for a column or if it's for your row. So this way, the assistive device reads out all the information from the table data appropriately to a user that is using an assistive device. And in our T-foot, we have a table data element using a col-span attribute that spans 5 columns. And it's just a note that says we aren't displaying all of our data. And we will make this file size a bit smaller so that the person understands that this information is available, but it's not as important as the rest of the information. We also need to add some styles to make it easier to look at this table, so we have constrained the width of the table, collapsed our borders, added spacing to our table data and table header elements, and added background colors as well to help the user understand which column or row the data belongs. And if we look down a table row, we're using code to add a background color to alternate rows, and this is helpful again for someone looking at a table to identify which row the data belongs. So if we were to look at our table on our demo code page, we see that it is in section 1. We have our 3rd level heading 3 for section 1, and we have our 4th level heading H4 for table demo. We have our caption that lets the user know what information is in the table, and you can see that we have some styling that helps identify rows and columns. It makes it easier to look at the data across and understand it. For example, you understand that you're still dealing with pet number 5, and we have our footer information that lets the user know that we only have partial data and we can get additional data upon request. Going back to your demo code page, we now can move to section 2 where I've taken information from the forum videos, and I chose code that I thought might be helpful for you to take a look at on your own and be able to play with. So this is the code for a radio button, and we're going to do the same thing where we adjust the table heading to be an H4 level heading. You use radio buttons in the situation where you have a question, and when you want the user to give you a single response. So in this case, the question is, do you have a pet? And they can either respond with yes, they have a pet, no, they don't have a pet, or they don't want to really tell you whether they have a pet or not. But they can't tell you yes, no, and they don't want to say. It wouldn't make any sense. When you want the user to give you more than one response, then you will choose to use a checkbox. So the radio buttons are for a particular type of a response where you only want the user to tell you one answer. And we know that this is a radio button because we have a type attribute that tells the browser that it is a radio button. And in this case, you need to have each response have a same name value, so pet status is the same in each. We see that we use the for attribute to bind the correct label to the correct input. So for the for attribute will match the ID attribute. And we also use the checked attribute to denote which answer we want to have pre-selected, which is prefer not to say, or we don't know, or unknown status for pet status. And then we also have our input to submit the answer once it's selected. So we go back to our demo code page and we hit section 2, and now we can move to see the radio button, and you can see our navigation will help toggle between sections 1 and 2. And so we have our radio buttons. We already see that we have adjusted the heading to a level 4 heading. And now if we select yes, then it will automatically unselect prefer not to say. We submit a response and then the form resets, so then now we'll have prefer not to say again selected. So now we have our output code for section 3. And again, we're going to adjust the heading to become an H4 level heading. And the output is used for mathematical calculations. And in this case, we have a range input where we will have step increments of 1, a minimum value of 0, and a maximum value of 10, and a preset value of 5. And then the second element is a number input whose preset value is 50, and the user can increase or decrease it. And the form element has an onInput attribute that has our mathematical calculation, which is that x equals the value of a multiplied by the value of b. And because our present value of a is 5 and our preset value of b is 50, 5 times 50 is 250. And then after that, the user can adjust these values by adjusting the range value and the number value. And finally, we have our input for submit, and they will submit the user's response. So now if we go to our demo code page and we hit section 3, we will move to our output calculation, and we can adjust the range slider that goes from 0 to 10. And if we keep the number at 50, you see that it basically increases the output by 50 up to a maximum of 500, or 50 times 10. And then the number can be adjusted up and down. Makes the math a little bit less straightforward, but again, you are just multiplying. So in this case, 10 times 49 is 490, and the increments change differently. So you can decide to adjust the code within each section, delete the code that I've already selected here, or add whatever code you want. But if you want to keep these, then you can always add another section. So you can just take the code in section 3 and copy it into section 4, and then if we save and refresh, you can go back to our demo page and you can see that now section 4 exists. But we also have to adjust our navigation bar. And the spacing still applies for section 4 because we're affecting any code that is called section. So the section will automatically, when you add it, have a 500 pixels of height. So to add to the navigation, you just select one of the list items and you copy and paste it. And then you adjust the text to say section 4. And you also have to adjust the href attribute to say hashtag section 4. Once you save and refresh, go back to the demo page and you will see that section 4, as it will now appear as a button, and it is clickable and will toggle between section 3 and section 4 and section 2 and section 1, however you would like to do it. And so now you can add whatever code you want into section 4, and when you save and refresh, you can view the code on the demo page and see how it looks and see if it looks correct, and you can adjust it and play with it to see how well it works, like you did with the output code where you yourself can decide which numbers are being multiplied together. So you can continue to add additional sections. At some point, you will get to a situation where the navigation will need adjustment because it won't be able to fit so many buttons across. So that'll be really the limiting factor in how many sections you have. Or you can go back and just redesign your navigation to fit whatever you're doing. So here we are again in BB Edit looking at the code of our demo page. And one thing that I noted with our CSS that we need to go back and correct is if you start scrolling up, now that we have some content in our sections, you notice that this white background color doesn't really extend all the way over. And so when you scroll up, the table that extends out will look like this. And this is, of course, not desirable. And what's happening here is basically the background color is extending over what content we have included. So we only have 4 buttons, and so right after that, the background color ends. So how would we fix something like this? And basically all you need to do is our header, we want it to extend the entire width of the browser window, and so we're going to just say 100%. We'll save that and then refresh our demo code page, and then now you see that the white bar extends all the way across because our header extends all the way across. So we've gone back and fixed that. And then the other thing I wanted to show you quickly is how do we go about adding, a font that we desire for our page rather than having it pick whatever font it finds. So if we go to Google Fonts, you have all sorts of different fonts that you can choose, and you can choose whichever font you like. So when you open Sans in your Google font window, it'll give you all the options that are available. So you have light, regular, semi-bold, bold, extra bold, and italic, and you can look at the glyphs palette. It'll tell you a little bit about the designer and the licensing. So one of the main reasons that people use Google Fonts, of course, is because you don't have to pay licensing fees with Google Fonts, and that's why they've become particularly popular. As a Adobe user, you also probably have access to Adobe Typekit, and so the process would be similar for any web-based font foundry, that you would go to the page and you need to get the embed code. And so for Google Fonts, the way you do it is you select which styles you want to embed. And so I'm just going to pick the light italic, the regular italic, and the bold italic. And if we know that we're not going to use a particular weight, then we shouldn't include it. I'm kind of keeping it open by selecting all of these. And why is that important? Well, because the more fonts you select from the family, the more that your page is loading, and it slows it down. So you really only want to choose the fonts that you know that you're going to use when coding your web page. So what you have here is there's 2 different options for bringing in the font into your web page. There's the link option, and there's the @import option. And what I'm going to do is use the link option. And there's also the option of downloading if you are using your the Google font into something like your InDesign or other type of desktop version. So the other thing you want to make note of is it says here, CSS rules to specify families. And the reason this is important is because you want to know how you're going to write this out for it to choose the font that you're loading in. So Open Sans is a font that has actually 2 words. And so whenever you're using a font that has 2 words, it needs to be in these single quotes on each side. And you need to put that space in between. And this is actually a font stack, meaning if it can't find Open Sans for whatever reason, so perhaps Google servers are down or there's an issue with the internet and it can't load the font, and in that case it's going to choose a sans serif font preferentially over a serif font when it's trying to find a font to use, since it cannot load Open Sans for whatever reason. So we've copied our code, and we need to go to our code page. And what we're going to do is we're going to add it. So anything like loading fonts, loading style sheets, that all goes in our head. So we have our opening tag for our head here, and we have our closing tag for our head here. And we're going to put this above the styles. We want it to load the font in before it's trying to do the styles, because we're going to start entering the use of the font in our styles in the style section, so it needs to have already loaded the font. So we want to put it beforehand. And what I'm going to do is create a typography section in our styles. So this code is basically telling the browser to connect to Google, to connect to the Google API, to get these fonts, the open sans and the weights that we chose. So the light italic, the regular italic, and the bold italic. And so if we want to start including this in our page and we want it to be used globally, we can say the body, and it will, anything that's a child of the body is going to pick up this command. So we want to tell it the font family, and we want to use those single quotes and put the words open sans, as we saw on the page. And then our stack, that if it can't find open sans, it's going to pick any sans serif it finds. So if we save and refresh, we now see that it's pulling in a sans serif, and it's pulling it in globally. So it's affected all of the typography on the entire page. And it's still using the hierarchy that comes kind of preset, because we're using H1, H2, H3, H4, and paragraph text and list text. But now that you've entered a font, you can actually control the size of things by adding into our style sheet. So if we wanted to affect the size of, let's say, the H1, we would tell it, font size, and then we could pick a number. We can see how this looks. And then for leading, the equivalent of leading on the web is essentially the line height. And a standard reading would be 1.3 to 1.5 ems. We're going to save that and take a look. So you can see it got a little smaller, and it's kind of close to here. We can either push it down by increasing the line height. We can also see if we can add some spacing above our navigation. So if we look here, we've told it to have no padding around. But what we want to do maybe is add a little bit of padding to the top and the bottom. And so if you are using the padding or margin, typically you add 4 numbers, and that represents the top, right, bottom, and left. But if you're okay with the top and the bottom being the same number and the left and right being the same number, then you can just use the 2 numbers. And again, so here 20 pixels represents the top and the bottom, and 0 represents the left and the right. So now if we save that and we refresh, then you can see that it's a little bit pushed down. And I think what I'll do actually is add the line height to the body. So we have our 6 levels of headings, and we're just going to make it kind of cascade down in size. Presented by Designers Learn Code.